This is a story about a family that was treated like trash, but turned out to be the ones holding all the cards. Before we dive in, do me a favor, hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell. Thanks. Back to the story. I'll never forget the smell of the air that day. It was heavy and thick with the scent of wet pavement and old leaves. I was driving my old Ford truck, the one with the rusted fenders and a heater that takes 10 minutes to kick in. I'd spent the morning out on the lake, just me and the silence, pulling in a few bass to fry up for dinner. To everyone in this town, I'm just Samuel, the old guy who lives in a cabin by the woods and wears flannel shirts with holes in the elbows. They see me, and they think I'm just getting by on a small pension. But that day, everything changed. I was heading home when I saw them. There, on a park bench that was soaked through by the freezing rain, sat my son David. He looked smaller than I remembered, his shoulders hunched over like he was trying to hide from the world. Tucked under his arm was my grandson, little Toby. Toby was only 6, and he was shivering so hard his teeth were chattering. He was clutching a dirty teddy bear, the one with the missing eye that he takes everywhere. Next to them, sitting in the mud, were 3 suitcases. The zippers were broken and David's clothes were spilling out into the dirt. I pulled the truck over so fast the tires screamed. I didn't even grab my coat. I ran over to that bench and put my hand on David's back. When he looked up at me, his eyes were red and puffy. He didn't have to say a word for me to feel his heart breaking. He told me that his father-in-law, a man named Arthur Thorne, had fired him that morning. Arthur didn't just fire him, though. He kicked him out of the house and told David that our whole family was nothing but trash. He told my son that his blood wasn't good enough to carry the Thorne name. I looked at Toby's face, pale and scared, and I felt something inside me that had been asleep for 15 years. It was a cold, sharp anger. It wasn't the kind of anger that makes you want to yell. It was the kind that makes you want to get to work. Arthur Thorne thinks he's a king because he has a big office and a mansion on the hill. He thinks money is what makes a person worthy. He has no idea who I really am. He thinks I'm a fisherman who doesn't know a thing about the world. He has no clue that before I moved to that cabin, I was the man who built the very foundation this city stands on. He doesn't know that I own the bank that holds the mortgage on his precious house. I could take everything he loves with one signature. I told David to pick up the bags and get in the truck. I told him it was time to show Arthur what our family is actually made of. As we drove away, David started talking, his voice cracking every few words. He'd worked for Arthur for 5 years. He wasn't just an employee. He was the one who made the whole company run. He'd stay up until 3 in the morning fixing computer systems and writing code that made Arthur look like a genius. He did it all because he loved his wife, Sarah, and he wanted to prove to her father that he could be a good provider. But Arthur never saw a partner. He saw a servant. That morning, Arthur called him into the big corner office. He didn't even ask David to sit down. He just tossed a folder on the desk and told him he was done. No reason, no thank you, just get out. When David went home to tell Sarah, he found the locks were already changed. His clothes were already in those cheap suitcases on the porch. Sarah wouldn't even open the door. She just sent a text saying her father was right, that David was small time, and she needed someone who belonged in her world. It made my blood boil to think of that little boy standing on the lawn, crying while his mother stayed inside. Arthur had even looked at Toby and told him he'd be better off without his father's cheap blood. I gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. Arthur Thorne thought he was playing with a weak old man. He didn't realize he was poking a lion that had been waiting for a reason to roar. I told David and Toby they were safe now. We pulled up to my cabin, and I told David to make some hot chocolate for the boy. But as soon as they went inside, I didn't go in with them. I stayed out on the porch and pulled out a phone I hadn't touched in over a decade. It wasn't a cheap phone. It was a line that connected me to people who still jump when I call. I told the man on the other end that I needed everything on Arthur Thorne. I wanted his bank accounts, his debts, his partners, and every secret he was hiding. I sat there watching the sun go down over the lake, and I knew Arthur was hiding something. Rich guys like him don't just explode and kick people out for no reason. Usually, when a man starts screaming about how important he is, it's because he's terrified that people will find out he's actually a failure. I was going to find the crack in his armor, and then I was going to break it wide open. An hour after I made that call, my phone buzzed with a file that would change everything. As I scrolled through the numbers, I started to laugh, but it wasn't a happy sound. Arthur was in deep trouble. He'd spent the last 3 years living like a billionaire on a millionaire's budget. He'd taken out massive loans to buy private jets and houses he couldn't afford. He was a month away from losing it all. But there was something even darker in the records. Arthur was planning a big charity party for the next week, telling everyone he was raising money for kids. But really, he was planning to sell a famous family painting to a fake company in another country. He was trying to wash his dirty money and run away before the banks caught him. And then I saw the worst part. The money he'd thrown at David as a parting gift, the severance he called it, was fake. I went out to the truck and grabbed the envelope David had left in the glove box. I took it to my desk and turned on a bright lamp. I pulled out the $100 bills and held one up to the light. The blue strip in the middle didn't shimmer. The paper felt too smooth. Arthur wasn't just a jerk. He was a criminal. He'd fired David because David was the only one smart enough to see the holes in the company's math. Arthur had to get rid of the only honest man in the building so he could finish his crime. I looked into the cabin and saw David sitting at the table, looking at a pile of bills and trying to figure out how he was going to pay for a motel. He looked so tired, like he'd given up on himself. I walked over and put my hand on his shoulder and told him not to sell his car or worry about a thing. I told him we were staying right there and preparing for a fight. David looked confused because he still thought I was just a fisherman. He didn't know that the trash Arthur kicked out was about to buy the whole dump. I spent the next few days teaching David how to handle the business talk he'd need for the party. I told him how to stand, how to look Arthur in the eye, and how to never show fear. While he practiced, I made a few more stops. I drove into the city, but I didn't go to the fancy part of town. I went to a dusty old office building near the docks. Most people thought the company there had closed years ago, but I still had the keys. Inside, I logged into a private system that I used to run my empire. I pulled up the mortgage for Arthur's mansion. He owed $10 million, and since I owned the bank, I could see every little mistake he'd made. He'd missed a property tax payment by just a few days. In a world of big money, that's all it takes. I sent a legal notice to his email, letting him know the bank was reviewing his entire loan. I was pulling the rug out from under his feet, and he didn't even know it yet. Then David called me, sounding out of breath. He'd found out that Arthur had been moving money into a fake construction company for years, and the company was registered in Sarah's name. My son's wife had known about the stealing the whole time. She helped her father hide the money while David worked himself to the bone. That was the final straw. It's one thing for a father-in-law to be a jerk, but it's another thing for a wife to betray her husband and son for a few diamonds. I told David to stay at the cabin and keep Toby safe. I went to the bank and spoke to the manager, a man named Miller who used to work for me. He nearly fell out of his chair when he saw me. I told him Arthur was going to come in looking for an emergency loan, and I wanted Miller to tell him no. I sent Miller all the proof of the fake money and the shell companies. Miller's face went white. He realized that Arthur had been laundering money right under his nose. I told Miller to make sure 2 VIP seats were reserved for us at the party, but to use a different name so Arthur wouldn't know we were coming. I left the bank feeling like a hunter who'd finally cornered his prey. Arthur thought he was playing with a weak old man, but he was about to find out that the trash he threw away was the only thing standing between him and a prison cell. The day of the big party arrived, and the whole city was talking about Arthur Thorne's charity auction. To everyone else, it looked like a night of glitz and glamour, but to me, it was the day the trap would finally snap shut. I spent the morning helping David. We went to a small shop I knew and bought him a watch. It wasn't a shiny fake like Arthur's. It was a heavy silver piece that looked like it belonged to a man who owned the company, not a man who worked for it. David looked in the mirror, and for the first time in years, I saw the confidence come back into his eyes. He wasn't the man crying on the park bench anymore. He was a Rodriguez. He asked me what we'd do if Arthur called security or tried to humiliate us again. I told him that security works for the person who pays the bills, and by the time we walked into that ballroom, Arthur wouldn't be able to pay for a cup of coffee. I dressed in a dark suit I hadn't touched in a decade. It still fit perfectly. I didn't look like a fisherman anymore. I looked like the man who built this city. We dropped Toby off with a friend who promised to keep him happy with movies and pizza. Then we drove to the hotel in a black town car I'd hired. As we pulled up, I saw Arthur standing at the top of the stairs in a white tuxedo, laughing with a group of rich guys. Sarah was beside him in a silk dress, looking cold and beautiful, pretending she didn't have a family out in the woods. When we stepped out of the car, photographers started snapping pictures. They didn't know who we were, but we looked like we belonged. We walked up those stairs and Arthur didn't see us at first. He was too busy bragging about his family painting, saying only a man of status deserved to own it. That's when he turned around and saw us. His face went from a smile to pure disgust. He almost dropped his champagne. He hissed at us, asking how we got past the gate and telling us to stay in the gutter. David didn't flinch. He told Arthur we were there for the auction and wanted to see if there was anything worth our time. Arthur laughed and asked what money we'd use, mocking the change he'd thrown at David in the dirt. He called for security, but the guard just looked at his device and said we were at the top of the VIP list. Arthur's jaw dropped. He couldn't believe it. Reporters started pushing past him to talk to us, asking if it was true that our group was looking to buy up Arthur's debt. Arthur tried to claim his company was stronger than ever, but I stepped forward and asked him why the bank had frozen his accounts 4 hours ago. The color drained from his face. The people around him stopped laughing and started whispering. Arthur tried to pull out his phone, but his hands were shaking so much he dropped it. I told him he was a fraud, and we walked past him in the ballroom. We sat at table 1, right in the center. A few minutes later, Arthur and Sarah had to sit across from us to keep up appearances. Sarah wouldn't look David in the eye, but Arthur couldn't stop staring at us, sweating through his suit. He hissed that the auction would save him and he'd sue us until we were back on that bench. David leaned in, not angry, just disappointed. He told Arthur that he didn't just lose his money, he lost his family. He asked Arthur how much a painting was worth compared to his grandson. Arthur just barked that the painting was worth more than David would ever have. The lights dimmed and the auctioneer took the stage. This was it. Arthur stood up to give a speech, trying to act brave, telling everyone the money would go to charity. But his voice was shaking. The auctioneer started the bidding at $1 million. Silence filled the room. Arthur looked around, waiting for his rich friends to help, but nobody moved. They'd heard the rumors. Nobody wanted to buy from a man who was about to go to jail. The auctioneer dropped the price to $500,000, but still nothing. Arthur was standing there looking like a fool. He shouted into the mic that the painting was a masterpiece. That's when David's voice rang out, saying he'd bid $1. The whole room gasped. Arthur looked like he was going to explode. David stood up and said $1 was exactly what Arthur's legacy was worth. Suddenly, the doors at the back swung open. 6 men in FBI jackets walked in. The music stopped and the lights went up. The lead agent walked straight to the stage and told Arthur Thorne he was under arrest for money laundering and making fake money. The room erupted in shouts and camera flashes. Arthur screamed at me as they grabbed him, calling me a fisherman. I told him quietly that I was the man who owned the bank and I was going to make sure Toby never heard his name again. As they dragged him out, Sarah started crying, trying to follow them. She stopped and looked at David, claiming her father forced her to help and begging for us to be a family again. David looked at her hand on his sleeve and then into her eyes. He told her the house wasn't hers anymore. It belonged to the bank, and his father owned the bank. He said she'd watched our son cry in the rain and didn't even open the window. He pulled away, and we walked out into the cool night air. We didn't go back to the cabin to hide. We went to the top floor of the tallest building in the city, the headquarters of my old company. I led David into the boardroom and told him it was his new office. He was worried he didn't know how to run it, but I told him he'd already built Arthur's company from nothing. He had honesty, which was something Arthur never had. David spent the next few hours saving the jobs of the workers Arthur had scammed and making a plan to pay people back. While he did that, I signed the papers to evict Sarah from a mansion. I didn't do it to be mean. I did it because that house was bought with stolen money. I set her up in a small apartment and a fund for basic needs, but she'd have to learn to work for a living. By sunset, the news was everywhere. The secret billionaire had returned. We picked up Toby, and when he saw his dad in a sharp suit with a big smile, he jumped into his arms and called him a superhero. We didn't go to a fancy dinner. We went back to my cabin, built a campfire, and roasted hot dogs under the stars. It felt like the world was right again. But I had one last thing to do. I drove to the jail to see Arthur. He wasn't in a tuxedo anymore. He was in an orange jumpsuit. He lunged at the glass, screaming that I'd ruined everything. I told him I'd played the fisherman because I wanted my son to be a man of character, to know that love and honesty are what matter. I told him his name was being scrubbed off every building in the city, and he'd only be remembered in a court record. His face crumbled. He realized his legacy was dead. I walked out and didn't look back. Now a few months have passed. I still live in my cabin and I still go fishing, but the sadness is gone. David runs the biggest company in the city with a kind heart, and Toby is growing up knowing he is loved and worthy. Every time I look at my old rusty truck, I smile. It reminds me that a man in an old shirt can still change the world. And it reminds me that the greatest revenge of all is living a life full of love while the people who try to break you are forgotten. Share your thoughts on this story in the comments section. Like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell. See you in the next video. Peace out.